to be part of this conference. So as I said, as Bernhard already said, Disclosure and the Pace of Drug Development is the title of this paper. It's joint work with my fabulous co-authors, Colleen Cunningham, Charles Hodgson, and Sijun Wang. Everything that's great about this paper that I'm about to tell you is, of course, their work, and anything else that's not so great about the paper is probably because of my own failings. I'm also very, very grateful to all the comments that we're going to get from Stefan. I should also say that this paper is somewhat preliminary still, so comments are particularly appreciated at this stage. Okay, so what is this about? It is, as you can see, about drug development, and in line with this conference, it analyzes what the role of disclosure is, and particularly change in the disclosure regime, and how that affected not only how much firms are disclosing, but also how fast they're developing drugs. Now, the main way that drugs are developed or tested are clinical trials. They are used by pharmaceutical developers to learn about the efficacy and safety of new drugs. There's tons and tons of money spent on this. It's one of the most important sectors overall, of course, in healthcare, but in particular, it's also one of the most important sectors for innovation. A very, very large global share of investments in scientific research, but also because of this, a huge improvement in our standard of living, where, one of the things that I've listed here is that the overall cancer death rate in the United States decreased by 34% over the last 35 years. So that's amazing. And we're obviously interested in how various policies affect how fast drugs are developed. And the thing that we're particularly going to study here is how drugs progress from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3 until they finally get approved. Now, you may be familiar, this crowd obviously knows a lot about disclosure, that there is already a very relatively strict disclosure regime for phase 2 trials in the United States. It's called clinicaltrials.gov. It was created in 2007 by the FDA Amendments Act. It basically says you have to register your phase 2 trial. But importantly, there's no explicit mandate to disclose the results. So other firms know that you may have started various trials. They do not necessarily know how those trials particularly ended. Okay? And so what we're going to study is actually a new rule that came into play in 2017, so a decade later, where firms are now also going to be required to disclose results. Okay? Now, this lack of trial result disclosure is, of course, a source of controversy. So in 2015, for example, the WHO called for full disclosure of clinical trials. There's much discussion about this also, that we should have more disclosure, because if we have disclosure, then firms can learn from each other, and potentially that speeds up the development of various pharmaceutical trials and drugs. Now, in response to some of this, the FDA implemented a final rule on clinical trial results disclosure in 2017. Okay? That required the results of all phase 2 trials to be disclosed 1 year after trial completion. And not only did it say that you have to do this, but if you don't do it, you're going to get fined for if you don't disclose those results. So hopefully this is stringent. So what we're going to do in this, we're now going to ask the economist question, which is, if you have disclosure, that's going to be great because it spills over to other firms. Other firms can learn from you, and maybe that means that actually we get faster to drug development. However, this increased disclosure may also slow down research because of a free riding incentive. And that's, I think, a classic economist perspective, that we immediately think of what are the unintended consequences of policies. And the unintended consequences of these policies, that if I know that you are developing a somewhat related drug, shouldn't I just wait and learn from you rather than conducting my own expensive trial in all of this? Okay? And so the cost of running trials is quite high. Why don't I just wait for you and find out whether you are successful developing a similar drug before I launch into developing a drug like this? Okay? So disclosure might allow competitors to catch up, and that reduces the expected value of investment. So we're interested in what is the effect of this disclosure rule on the speed of development of these pharmaceutical drugs. Yep. So 3 simple research questions. Number 1 is, does this rule actually change disclosure itself? I think that's the standard, very somewhat uninteresting question. Okay. The second thing is, I think, more interesting. What does it do to the investment in clinical trials? And then third, and this part is, I think, the trickiest part, and where we have not made much progress, as you'll see, is how should all information disclosure policy be designed optimally? Okay, for that we need a counterfactual model. We need a counterfactual prediction. We need a structural model, which we are in the process of developing, but have not done so far. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to answer questions 1 and 2. For that, we analyze data on the history of all industry-sponsored clinical trials from 2010 to 2020. Okay. Now, here are the main preliminary findings that we have. Number one is the final rule that came into existence in 2017 increases the disclosure of trial results around the 1-year deadline. So you have to report a year after you concluded trial. Indeed, there's a marked increase in the disclosure of trials, and particularly of unsuccessful trials. Number two, phase 2 research is around 33% slower after the policy change. So that's a really, really massive, big change. Okay? And to my greatest surprise is that how has nobody documented this before we wrote this paper? So it's, I think, a really, really big result, and it shows up in various ways. It shows up in the length of phase 2 trials. It shows up in the time between phase 2 and phase 1 trials. And it also shows up on the intensive margin of how many trial sites you run. So how fast you scale up a trial. And then 3, we also find heterogeneous effects that are consistent with free riding incentives and better sorting. So we find that the slowdown in this drug development is more in these trials. So I should say, we only focus on one part of drug development. That slowdown is more significant for drugs where the potential information externality is larger. And the average MOA, so that's the mechanism of action, trial success rates, they actually rise following the policy change. So it's not all bad. In a sense, seems like there is slowdown because of free riding, but on the other hand, there's also learning from firms. And when other firms are successful, then maybe I sort into those more promising areas where successes have already occurred. Okay, and the last part is the structural model, which I will not have time to cover. I'll just give you a glimpse of it, where we're trying to estimate the model to quantify the effects of counterfactual disclosure policy. Lots of related literature, and I'm sorry if I forgot you to include your work. If I have also forgotten to do so in the paper, please email me. I'd be more than happy to cite your work. Just to fix ideas, and I'm going to be very brief here, we also have a very simple model setup that Stefan has not yet seen. It's basically trying to figure out, can we formalize this learning versus competition idea? And there what we have is, you can do this very simply. Imagine that you have 2 firms in 2 periods. The firms choose when to run a trial. So they can either run a trial in the first period or in the second period. If you run it in the first period, then you can get payoffs relatively faster, or maybe for a longer time. But if you wait, then you can learn potentially from the signal of the other firm. Now, you only observe the signal of the other firm if it is disclosed, and that depends on the disclosure policy. So the disclosure affects the observability of that signal of the other firm to you with the probability of alpha. Okay? Now we have a specific structure for this model, which is that either the signals are perfectly correlated, so you learn perfectly whether stuff works or doesn't work from the other firm, or they're entirely independent. We also have a second parameter in this model, which is that there's competition, okay? Which is when both firms develop the drug or are successful with their trials, then they take away from each other's monopoly payoff. Okay, and so you don't necessarily want to develop if you already know that the other firm has succeeded. Okay, so there's a competition aspect which actually deters you from entering as a follow-up. Okay, but then there's also the other aspect, which is that when you see that the other firm is successful, then you're more eager to do it because you learn that particular mechanism of action, or that particular type of drug, or that particular type of trial is more likely to be successful. Okay, So two things that come out of this, okay, which I just tell you the proposition, okay, is imagine that the rho basically captures how much correlation is there in the signals between the two firms when they run trials. Okay? Now, when rho is super correlated, okay, then what can happen is you can learn from the other firm. But when you can learn from the other firms, so the rho is very, very high, then obviously you would want to wait and figure out, did the other firm have a success? Okay? If it did have a success, then we're going to be just do this mixing strategy and say, okay, sometimes I develop in the first period, sometimes I don't start a trial in the first period. But that mixing probability, how likely you are to start a trial immediately in the first period, is affected by the amount of disclosure. So this is the alpha here. This is the last part here, the partial gamma, partial alpha. Gamma says the probability with which you start a trial in the first period, okay, that is decreasing in the amount of disclosure. Okay, if there's lots and lots of disclosure that you can expect to hear from the other firm, then you're just going to wait until the second period to hear whether they were successful. Okay. Similarly, however, this also works on the other way a little bit, which is that if there is competition, then when you hear that the other firm was successful, then that reduces your market size. So if the other firm was successful, that reduces your market size. You don't necessarily want to come into that same market if you've learned that there is already a competitor that has successfully innovated. Okay, and then similarly, here it is the case that this partial gamma 1 by partial gamma alpha by partial alpha is decreasing. So again, if you have more disclosure, you can condition on whether the other firm was successful. And in this case, in the competition case, again, you would want to delay. And so these are two forces that are playing here that we're going to try and analyze to some extent also in our empirical setup. Okay, so let me dive into the data on all of this. We have tons of very, very rich data. For those of you who have seen some of my work on killer acquisitions, okay, there's a wonderful economies of scope here, which is that we're using a very, very similar data set here, which is just looking at the drug level, trial level, reported results, outcome measures, and even more so, we can also look at particular projects and see how much trial investment is there. So not just are trials successful, okay, but also how many trial sites are there, which is a measure of the intensive margin on all of this, okay? So we're going to ask, okay, what happened? Let me just skip over this. Okay, this is the additional data that we have. If you go to clinicaltrials.gov, you can look at the change logs of this. So we can see how firms are adding sites, what's happening. Can we say something about how big those sites are? Are they successful? What are they reporting? Okay, so it's a quite rich set of data. You can also see that various phase 2 oncology trials here have different ways of progressing. Okay, so I've plotted 3 different ones here. Okay, you can see this is not a particularly beautiful data graph because it comes out of the paper relatively new. Okay, and you can see sometimes these trials scale up very abruptly, like the blue one. Okay, where really you have the number of active sites just shoots up. About 30 minutes since the start, 30 months since the start of the trial. And then some of the other ones are more gradual, like the green line, where sort of you scale up trial sites over time. How fast you scale up, of course, also determines how fast you're going to conclude these trials. Okay, and so you shouldn't just think of like I start a trial and then immediately afterwards the results are realized, but rather what happens is that maybe I learn faster depending on how many trial sites I have. Okay. Now, so sites are added over time. There's about 2 changes for the median trial. Okay. And the way that usually this progresses is that first there are no active sites, they're just crew recruiting. Then there are these pilot sites, and then it scales up and you have more and more sites. Okay. This is what this looks like in the more sort of an aggregate data. How many active sites do these trials have? So what I've plotted here on the left panel is the trial progress in terms of percentage. Okay, so how close are you to concluding the trial? You can see over time the number of active sites really scales up the closer it gets to the conclusion of the trial. On the right panel, I also show you that it depends a little bit, on how fast you scale, on whether you have successes or not. Okay, so I've split it out here just in terms of successful trials and unsuccessful trials. The unsuccessful trials, they don't scale up quite as fast, and that's because probably there's interim information that leaks out, or that becomes available, and you figure out, okay, this works or it doesn't work. Okay, and only if it really does work do you then sort of scale up. Okay. So the decision to scale up the trial is likely responding to some of these interim results. Okay, so let's get into the policy here. Does this disclosure policy that comes into effect in 2017, does that change anything? Okay, so what we're going to do first is we're just going to plot the cumulative probability that a trial is reported by the days since trial completion for the pre and the post policy period. Okay, so these are Kaplan-Meier curves basically to account for the truncation of the data here. This is what this looks like. Okay, everything that I plot here in blue is the pre-policy period. Okay, so how much does gets reported. On the x-axis is the days since completion. So the trial has concluded. Okay, the results, however, have not necessarily been reported. Okay, well, if it just concluded, obviously zero stuff gets reported. But then it has to get reported according to the new rule in the post-policy period from 2017 to 2019. And you can see the red line abruptly jumps up after 365 days. Okay, so this is nothing about development here. This is just saying, is there more disclosure due to this rule? Okay, and the answer is a very clear yes. Now, you'd expect this to go to 1 maybe, or to 100%, okay? But it seems quite clear that there's non-compliance, okay? And so the reason there's non-compliance is because the fines are not immediately imposed, okay? Some firms don't report stuff, okay? But nonetheless, you do see quite an important increase overall in the number of, in the percentage of results that are being reported here after 2017. Okay, now, what does this mean in overall terms? The probability of disclosure by 2 years since the completion increases from about 60% to 80%. Okay, and you can see where does most of that increased disclosure come from? It comes just around the 1-year deadline, the 365 days. Those two lines look pretty much exactly the same up to 365 days, and then they diverge. Okay, and then they stay parallel essentially after 365 days. Okay, now, what gets reported? This thing here just says there's more reporting of these trial results. Okay, what gets reported? This is somewhat presented here. Okay, and you can see this is again number of days since the completion. Okay, and the successful trials, they always get reported. Okay, but the unsuccessful trials, that's where you see the spike after the 365 days. So firms do not want to really report the unsuccessful trials. They only allow, basically post those unsuccessful trials if they have to, which comes into effect after the 365-day deadline. Okay? Why do firms have an incentive to delay disclosure of failure? Many reasons, okay, that lots of people have spoken about, have written about. We are going to just take this as given and say, really what's happening is there's more disclosure of unsuccessful trial. Okay, so now we're going to get into the economics part of this. This is, there's more disclosure. Does this disclosure affect how firms invest or develop these drugs and initiate these trials? Okay, so we're going to try and do 3 things. We're going to look at the time to complete these phase 2 trials. So how fast do you complete a trial? Number 2, we're going to look at how fast do you progress from phase 1 to phase 2. And then 3, we're going to look at the intensive margin, and we're going to ask how much investment is there in the trial sites within those phase 2 trials. Okay. Sample includes all industry-sponsored phase 2 trials, and there's no control group here, so you really have to think about this is a pre and post, and so we're still looking for a best way of really like cutting this more finely. Okay. Again, red line pre-period, blue line post period, you can see that the cumulative, blue line pre-period, red line post-period. Here, so previously you saw as I increased, as the disclosure policy comes into effect, the red line goes up. So there's more disclosure. Here you see the opposite. In terms of cumulative completion, so how fast trials being concluded, okay, you see a market fall down. Okay, and it goes so for the blue line down to the red line. If you do it on 1 year completion probabilities for particular years, okay, it falls quite discontinuously after the policy change. Let me show you one additional thing here in terms of the annual curves. The blue line and the red line on the left-hand side, okay, they're just pooling all of these together. But I can also plot the annual curves. Okay, so these are blue lines, the various shadings of blue are the pre-period, and the various shadings of red are the post-period. Okay, there's a very, very marked discontinuous decrease here. Okay, that it's not somewhat gradually that this is happening, but it really seems to be quite discontinuous just around the time when the policy goes into effect. Okay, all right. Now, this is now looking at rather than completion. Let's look at the times to start. So how likely are you to start another phase 2 thing after you've completed the phase 1? Okay, and again, you can see the blue line shift down to the red line. Okay, the median time between the end of phase 1 and start of phase 2 increases from around 50 days to around 400 days. Okay, again, the 1 year follow-up probability falls discontinuously, although there seems to be some anticipation of this already happening in 2016. Okay? Now, to test whether these changes are driven by composition of trials, okay, let's run a Cox proportional hazard models to control for the disease category, okay? And so this is not just the raw curves, but Cox model estimates with disease fixed effects, okay, and controlling for a bunch of other stuff. And you can see that there's a slowdown. The stars basically come in exactly around the 2017, okay? There is a bit of anticipation here already in terms of when it goes into effect in 2016. Okay, so the completion, complete, and start, they're both getting at the fact sort of like how fast do you complete and how fast do you start another trial. Okay, and again, a very marked increase here in how long it takes to start also to complete these trials. Okay, now number 3, I promised you some results on in the intensive margin. Does the slowdown in phase 2 reflect a reduction in trial-specific investment? Okay, maybe trials are getting slower because drug efficacy is becoming harder to learn or something else is going on. Okay, so what we're going to do is let's measure the number of sites open T months since the start of a particular trial. Okay, and just measure that. Okay, so measure the average number of trial sites. How many trial sites do you have open? Okay, in year Y relative to the baseline year 2010, controlling for various trial duration. Okay? And this is what it looks like. Again, blue line, pre-period, red line, post-period. The number of active sites, 40 months since the start, looks about the same. But how fast you scale up, okay? Not just do you start a trial or do you not start a trial, but also how many trial sites do you have for a given trial? That seems to be going down too. Okay, so consistent again with a longer time to complete phase 2, just because we're not opening as many trial sites. Now, one thing that we don't have, and I should be open about this, we don't know how many patients are in any of these trial sites. Okay, it could be that maybe the number of trial sites is just lower, but actually there are more patients in each trial site. So that could be offsetting it. We're in the process of scraping that from clinicaltrials.gov. Unfortunately, that number of patients per trial site is not particularly well reported. Okay, a couple of last things before I conclude. Okay, now the significant decline in trial investment is contemporaneous with increased disclosure of these trial results. Now, is this driven by some form of learning? Okay, if you have cross-drug information externality, that could lead to delayed investment due to free riding, which is what we hypothesized also with our theoretical model. So if drugs A and B belong to the same technology group, okay, so they use similar ways of how they work. They're not exactly treating the same disease, but they work in similar ways. Okay? Then I could condition my decision to invest in trial B on the outcome of trial A, and that would lead to free riding and delay, and then more disclosure or failures would lead to slower investment. Okay? So we're going to ask, is the evidence of this cross-drug learning from results disclosure? And then two, is the slowdown in investment larger from drugs where we expect the information externality to be more important? Okay. Now for this, what we're going to do is we're going to split drugs again into two components that they have. They have the mechanism of action, sort of how they work, and then T is the therapeutic class, which is what do they treat. You can think of the therapeutic class as they're in the same market, they're in the same competition space. Okay. And you can think of the mechanism of action as in the same technology space. Okay. And so learning can occur both about competition, but also about is this effective or not, which is about the mechanism of action. Okay. So we're going to ask, how does the decision to start a trial respond to the results of trials in the same competition area and the same technology area? Okay. Okay. So here's what we find. We find that you're more likely to start stuff, okay, if it uses the same mechanism of action. So if something was successful in phase 2, okay, here this is the 0.0165, the lower line here, the same mechanism, then you're more likely to start. If it was unsuccessful, then you're less likely to start it. If it is in the same therapeutic class, so it is in the same competition, okay, then you're actually less likely to start because you now figure out, oh, there's a competitor. Okay, maybe I shouldn't be exactly in this area because they were already successful. If, however, they were unsuccessful, you learn that, oh, my competitor has failed in this particular market. Okay, maybe with a different technology. Now I can go in there. So that illustrates sort of these opposing effects of competition and learning here. And you see that both mostly for phase 2 start, you see it a little bit for phase 1 and phase 3 start. Okay, so that results suggest some learning within the mechanism of action group, but also within the therapeutic class. But they go in opposite directions. Okay. Now, if the slowdown of investment is caused indeed by free riding, the effect should be largest, okay, for those drugs where there is more to learn from other trials. Okay? And so we're going to do the following thing. We're going to ask, okay, imagine there's a drug, okay, it's in a particular space. Okay? So if learning takes place within the mechanism, okay, there's no other drug in that particular mechanism, then you can't learn anything from those drugs, okay? Because there aren't any that are close enough to you. Okay? But if there are lots and lots and lots of other drugs being developed in that particular space, then you could potentially learn from them, provided that there's disclosure about it. Okay? So the change in disclosure policy does not affect incentive to invest in drugs, okay, if there are no other drugs in your closed space. But if there are tons of drugs, then disclosure should affect how fast you develop. Okay, so for each trial month, we're now going to count the number of completed but unreported trials. So stuff that is out there but has not been reported for drugs in particular spaces. Okay, so let me just say that. Let me skip here. What we find here is we find that, okay, you're responding to unreported trials by the policy period. Okay, in particular, you are likely to respond to it, particularly in the post-policy period. So when there is disclosure. Okay, so that means the trial completion is less likely to happen, okay, if there's tons and tons of unreported stuff in the post period. Okay, and then you see it also in the active or recruiting sites and the active sites, that there's a negative effect of how likely or how much you're investing essentially on this, given how much stuff is unreported. Okay. All right, let me say one last thing and then conclude. There also seems to be a positive effect in all of this. Okay, this is not yet in the paper that Stefan has seen. Okay, is that we also see a marked increase in the MOA level success rate following the policy changes. So what does that mean? It means that when you have more reporting, okay, in the 2017, it seems to increase the success rate. And that could very well be driven by sorting into more successful areas, which is that you're more selective now in what you go after because you have better information in terms of what is being reported. Okay, and that is in line with about a 3 percentage point increase in the MOA success rate. So the disclosure policy has some positive effects. It's not just slowing down development, but it also is leading to more successes, okay, in terms of what is being developed. Okay. All right. Let me just skip over the dynamic model. I don't have time to go into this. Okay, and it's also not particularly well developed. There's some funky graphs that I don't have time to explain, but let me just conclude and say the following. So we document these effects of the final rule on clinical trial, the results disclosure. Disclosure increases, but the start and the completion rate of clinical trials decreases. However, there's also a positive effect in that the average MOA level success rates seem to increase after the policy, and these results seem to be consistent with better learning. Okay? The investment in the clinical trials also forced most in technology groups where the potential cross-drug learning is the greatest, and that evidence is consistent with the free riding effect. Hopefully, the next time you see this paper, you'll see also a dynamic model of clinical trial investment, and where we want to quantify these effects and consider counterfactual disclosure policy. If you have thoughts on which counterfactual disclosure policy you would most like to see, please let me know. Thank you very much, and I look forward to Stefan's comments on our paper.